a group of Black and Indigenous men who served on the Patriot side during the Revolutionary War. Our speaker is John Dower, who has studied original sources about this unit and its connection to East Greenwich for a book that will be published next year. John is a North Kingstown resident, a historian, and a board member of Smith's Castle. His focus is on history. His focus on history has been on slavery, colonial law, and early civil rights. He's going to share some intriguing stories tonight about the, excuse me, the Black Regiment, and show us original documents about this unique unit. So with that, John, we'll ask you to proceed.
Thank you, Tom. And I thank the Preservation Society for inviting me here tonight. This is a topic that I have a lot of interest in, and it's something I've committed a lot of time to, and I hope that that comes out in my presentation tonight.
Yes.
Just going to share the screen here, and we'll be started in just a second. Okay, you should all have my screen now. And as Tom already mentioned, and what you see here on this first slide, we're going to be talking about East Greenwich, Rhode Island, which I'm sure that's where quite a few of you are at right now. I call it the birthplace of the Black Regiment of the Continental Army. That may be somewhat of a new story to some of you, but I believe when I get done tonight, after talking about this, you'll understand where I'm coming from. So first thing I'm going to show you here, this is an old map of the original 13 colonies, and I love the old maps. I'm going to show that one first because the next one I'm going to show you is not an old map, but it tells the story a whole bunch better. So this next map, we're looking at a map that's showing the 13 colonies, but they're in color. And again, not an attractive map, but you see up there in the right-hand corner. I've got to move some people over here for just a second. There we go. You see up here in the right-hand corner, you see little Rhode Island sitting in there between Massachusetts and Connecticut. One of the smaller states at that point in time, population-wise. And what transpired in 1776, Continental Congress and General Washington established quotas for all these new states. Early on, it was relatively easy to get men to fulfill these ranks in the Continental lines, but in a very short period of time, the novelty of going to war against Britain was wearing off, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to fill these regiments. Rhode Island was assigned the task of filling 2 regiments, and they also had a difficult time during this period because Newport was occupied by the British in 1776. So they were trying to juggle things. They were trying to supply men to fight on the Continental line and retain men back in Rhode Island to prevent invasion from the British, who were just a stone's throw across the bay practically in some places. So here we're going to take a quick look at the population statistics in Rhode Island leading up to the American Revolution. And as you see there in 1774, the census of the colony of Rhode Island, the white population by far exceeded. Oh, we're getting a little feedback there. I don't know if anyone else is getting it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I think it's gone now. There we go. Okay, so as you can see there by those numbers, the white population by far exceeded the people of color in Rhode Island. The the population of people identified as Black in the census was at 6%. In some areas of Rhode Island, it was considerably higher than in Newport. It would have been in, well into the double digits, and same thing in the Narragansett country. And the population of indigenous people had been declining steadily in those decades leading up to the American Revolution. And down here at the bottom, we see a census that was ordered by the state of Rhode Island in 1777 in order to determine the men between the ages of 16 and 60 that were able to bear arms. And if you take a look at those numbers and you compare them to the numbers up above, now this is basically the population of nearly all the men in Rhode Island. 16 to 60 covers a pretty good swath, and they look well underreported to me if you compare those to the numbers up above in 1774. So what exactly happened there, I don't know.
Hey, John?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but we are getting quite a strong echo. I wonder if everyone could please go on mute.
That should be better. How about now? Still getting an echo somewhere.
Yeah, we can hear you, John. It's just a little annoying, so you can proceed, I guess.
Okay. Just to give a little context, I threw in these numbers for East Greenwich at that time period in 1774, represented about 3% of the population. Let's go back just for 1 second and take a look at those numbers of the men of color at the bottom. We're looking at somewhere just under 500 men. And that represents a number that I'm sure at least caught the eyes of the political and military leaders of Rhode Island at the time. And we're going to see what came out of that. All right, these two men should be familiar to everyone in East Greenwich, James Mitchell Varnum and George Washington. And they had been communicating for at least several months prior to 1778 over how to fill these quotas. And a conversation went on with them by mail for the most part, but I believe they met in person on at least a couple occasions. And this one other gentleman, Colonel Christopher Green, I'm sure that he was in on the conversation. He was one of the officers under James Mitchell Varnum and had been for a couple years. By 1778, he was a well-known war hero. He'd been a prisoner of war, captured up in Canada early on, and then he was a hero at the Battle of Red Bank, and he'd seen quite a bit of fighting by this time period. And I know that he was in a conversation with James Mitchell Varnum. Reason being that on January 2nd, 1778, a letter from James Mitchell Varnum to George Washington, it is imagined that a battalion of Negroes can easily be raised there meaning Rhode Island. And he prefaces that statement by saying that some of his officers had suggested this idea to him. I think part of it was to take a little bit of the potential fallout, if there was one over this, away from himself, but yet he still wanted to make the suggestion. And Christopher Green had led men, various units up till that point in time that had men of color in it. So he was familiar with the ability of these men of African descent and also men of indigenous descent to be able to fight when the time came. So I believe that Christopher Green probably was one of the people that was pushing for this to happen. And we'll see why in just a second. Let's go back to those numbers just quick. So a battalion, there's various definitions for it, not being a a military historian per se, but I know a fair amount about it. Regiment and a battalion, sometimes the word is used interchangeably. Sometimes a battalion was 2 or 3 units within a regiment. But anyway, that's the numbers they were looking at. So they've got this idea, and this idea wasn't new. Back in 1775, Lord Dunmore, Royal Governor of Virginia, issued his proclamation, which basically said enslaved men, if they came forward and fought for the British, they would have their freedom. And it kind of worked there for at least a short period. And the officials in the newly found United States were more than aware of what occurred in Virginia with having enslaved men go to the other side. So that certainly wasn't something that they wanted to have happen. Here's what I believe is one of probably the main impetus for what would eventually be the enlistment of enslaved men. And this is Joseph Brown. He was enslaved by Beriah Brown. Some of you may have heard that name before. He was the high sheriff of what was then Kings County, now Washington County. And he lived in North Kingstown. And if we look a little bit closer at this letter that he wrote in his pension statement, he made the claim that he was a substitute for Christopher Brown, son of Beriah Brown. The use of substitutes is not well documented, and I believe it took place a lot more often than historians may have thought previously. I've got some circumstantial evidence that I'll show in my book, but it only showed up and was documented in pension records, and not very many men lived long enough to get a pension, as you'll hear as we get on with this story. But the use of substitutes was taking place at least by 1777. It was condoned by the Continental Congress and the General Assembly of Rhode Island. It was limited, but they were aware of it and condoned the use of substitutes. And in 1778, February 14th of 1778 to be precise, there were 5 capitals in Rhode Island where the General Assembly rotated meeting, and East Greenwich was up on February 14th of 1778, and they met at what was the Kent County Courthouse, now the site of the East Greenwich Town Hall, and they discussed this possibility that General Varnum had mentioned to George Washington. George Washington forwarded that information to Nicholas Cook, the governor, who laid it before the General Assembly. And what they came up with, and this is a rough draft of the act. Now, those of you that have looked at legislation back in this time period, they didn't always have a true title for legislation. Sometimes it was fairly vague, but I've named it the Act to Enlist Enslaved Men because that's exactly what the legislation was. And here we see what the legislation says. Every able-bodied Negro, mulatto, or manslave in this state may enlist into either of the said 2 battalions to serve during the continuance of the present war. And so enlisting shall, upon passing muster before Colonel Christopher Green, be immediately discharged from the service of his master or mistress. Pretty clear language there. If you enlisted in the Continental Army and you were an enslaved man, you earned your freedom. Couple points here. One is it was not well received by the slave owners of Rhode Island. They were compensated for their men that enlisted, and we'll be talking about that in just a couple minutes. And 2 other very important things. It says here, said 2 battalions. Well, as it turned out later on, that was changed. There were 2 regiments, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which became known as the Black Regiment, and that was only made up of men of color led by white officers. And then the other regiment was strictly white men with white officers. Then down here in the second comment, Colonel Christopher Green, that's our war hero. He had fought with men of color and he signed up for this. And I have no doubt that he pushed General Varnum to have this happen. So the recruiting process started. As a matter of fact, the first man to sign up was the day after the act was passed. That's a whole story of its own. But here in the Providence Gazette on March 28, 1778, Christopher Green places an ad. He's telling all his officers and recruiters in the field to assemble their men in East Greenwich. Again, we're talking about East Greenwich. They're going to meet for their first muster in East Greenwich. And the recruiting really only went on until June 10th. The act was eventually repealed due to pressure from the slave owners, probably the majority of them from the Narragansett country. Jeremiah Greenman, I don't know if anyone's ever looked at his Diary of a Common Soldier. It's a little tough reading at first, but he gives some tremendous information on what transpired within the Rhode Island lines during the American Revolution. And he says, this morning we paraded our slaves for the march to Greenwich. And some of you may have seen that sort of phonetic spelling of Greenwich before, but that's how he spelled it. He got word the day before the ad went in the paper, and he was already moving with his men the day before. So I'm going to jump right into this part of it. Why do I say East Greenwich is the birthplace of the Black Regiment? Home of James Mitchell Varnum. This would never have happened if he hadn't made the suggestion to George Washington. Home of the Kentish Guards. Christopher Green was in the Kentish Guards. James Mitchell Varnum was in the Kentish Guards. Numerous other men from the Kentish Guards were involved with the Black Regiment. Other names you're going to hear shortly. The act to enlist was passed right there in East Greenwich. Very important aspect of this whole thing. It was the staging area, as we see, for the new recruits and their first muster. They camped and trained there initially, and then they patrolled the area extensively from 1778 to 1780. Now, the Kentish Guards had been responsible for patrolling much of the area around East Greenwich prior to the Battle of Rhode Island, but when the Battle of Rhode Island took place, what we found was the militias were a little bit worn from that action, and it was decided by the military leaders to send the militias back home and leave them on standby. So the Continental lines from Rhode Island and some of the surrounding states actually patrolled the shoreline around Narragansett Bay after the Battle of Rhode Island. So all of these strong associations are there. There's no place that is more recognized as a home for the Black Regiment. And I'm going to call it the birthplace of the Black Regiment. I hope when we're done, everyone will agree with that. So here's 5 locations around East Greenwich. I'll just touch on these briefly. Associated that I found in various records that were mentioned: Fort Daniel up in the right-hand corner, Academy Field. I'm sure all of you are familiar with that. Training and burying ground. It's found on some old maps, and exactly what transpired, we don't know there. There's not a lot of records about the specific location of where they were training and camping. And then down on the left-hand side there, smallpox hospital. That's important because all of the recruits were required by General Washington to be inoculated. And the hospital was there to hold the men after they were inoculated for a period of time, so they wouldn't be back out into society spreading the disease around. Then the bottom right-hand corner, Forge Farm, which was then the home of Richard Green, and he was known for hosting officers of the Continental Army when they were staying in the area. So if I had to take a guess, I would say that a lot of the camps were set up somewhere close to that, because a lot of the patrolling took took place between East Greenwich and Quidnesset, and that would have been a perfect area for the camps to be set up. So I'm going to try to just clarify what the Black Regiment was, because it was only a certain period of time. It was officially the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which had its roots going back to 1775. Then in January of 1777, they decided to start designating the regiments with a state name and number in front of them. So we end up with the 1st Rhode Island and the 2nd Rhode Island in January of 1777. Those two units were both integrated, mostly white men with some men of color in there. And then when we have the act to enlist the enslaved passed in 1778, that's when they decide to segregate the units. So what you end up with is a segregated rank and file in the 1st Rhode Island, the men of color led by white officers. So it's mostly formerly enslaved recruits. The veteran men of color that had served the year before, and for some of them even before that, they're eventually merged into this 1st Rhode Island. And then there were a number of free men that also enlisted that spring. Now, it remained like that until there was a reorganization that took place in January of 1781, and they went back to one regiment, and that was basically a fully integrated unit, but it had companies that were segregated that just had African ancestry and indigenous ancestry soldiers making that up. Okay, so what we have number-wise, I identified 126 enslaved men, looking at every record I could find on them, looking through the General Assembly records, all various records that told anything about a man that was enslaved and his owner was compensated. So that's how I identified him. And it's at 126. I expect it'll stay there. I'm very close to the end of the research. That 126, we had 63 men from the veteran company, which was basically 44 men coming out of Valley Forge. They lost a few shortly after that, but I'll get to that in just a second. And then 19 other free men that enlisted that spring when the enslaved men enlisted. I got a big asterisk there. They're still moving targets, because what happens is I just can't resist going down rabbit holes and finding another tidbit of information. And along with that comes something else, and it changes my numbers. But I think they're going to stay pretty close to those numbers. And why was it called a Black Regiment? This in no way is a slight to the indigenous men that served. In some ways, it's a good story for the indigenous population, because by the time they passed this act, the number of indigenous people that was enslaved had dropped considerably. Various laws prevented the lifetime enslavement of indigenous people. So you see right there, the number of indigenous is 11. Only one of those 11 was an enslaved man. The other 10 were free men that had enlisted the year before. But you can see the men of African descent dominate the numbers of the races that I could identify. And that doesn't include mixed race. And I think that 82% of known race is probably even higher, and I'll explain that in just a second. But if you were to see this unit in 1778, these were all men of color, and Black was a term that was used in census and regularly used in narratives at the time. It's not a contemporary name given to them. It was used historically, and that's why I still use it. We have to find a way to identify that version of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, and that's what they were called. Here we'll take a quick look at the place of residence for these men. And here's why I say I'm sure that the number of men of African descent was even higher, because the plantations in Narragansett country is where the vast majority of the men that I could identify a residence, that's where they came from. Only thing that's got a little twist to it, if Newport had not been occupied by the British, Newport was by far the largest town in Rhode Island prior to 1776, when the British decided to show up there. They'd have been at the top, and the population of people of African descent was by far the highest number in Newport. So they were displaced, and some eventually found their way into the Continental line. East Greenwich, we see 6. These numbers all look fairly consistent with what you might expect as the size of the towns get smaller. And you see over on the right-hand side, Connecticut 1, that was a man from Stonington that had enlisted. And Maryland 1, that was a runaway from Maryland who was in for a couple years. He actually showed up at Valley Forge, of all places, to sign on to join up with the Continental Army. Why he went to Valley Forge, I don't know, but they took him in, and he served for a couple years until somebody recognized him, and then he gets sent back to Maryland to his owner. So the first man I'm going to talk about is pretty well known in East Greenwich, Windsor Fry. About the only question, and I went through his various records, and like many people that have looked at Windsor's story prior to me, when he became a free man, because he was enslaved. It's documented that he was owned by Thomas Fry. His race is described a few different ways. I went with Musty because 2 of the records I found identified him as Musty, given various identifications. You see there, I've got he enlisted in 1777. Those of you familiar with Windsor's story are going to say, oh, he was in well before that, and he was. But the actual date of when he first signed on was not until 1777, and we'll touch on that again in just a second. And he went the whole duration, over 6 years, got an honorable discharge and eventually a pension. Here's Thomas Fry showing a black male under 16. More than likely that wasn't Windsor in 1774. It seems like he was probably a couple years older than that, but I can't say it wasn't him, because age was whoever thought what it was at the time it was asked. And so who knows how old Windsor actually was and whether that might have been him. Here's a very important record. This is a statement signed by Captain Thomas Holden, who was a company commander in General Varnum's Continental Regiment when they marched to Boston. And he says Windsor Fry was in that company. So Windsor had a very long and storied career for a man of color, saw action in 10 different battles over his time period. And this would have been the first action that he saw in going to Boston for the siege of Boston. Here's the first muster that he appears on. And this is a kind of a unique muster. It covers the dates of January to December of 1777. So a lot of things going on there. And we do know that Windsor is on that, and he's also on this next muster. This is at Camp Paramus, July 10th, 1778. This would have been right after the Battle of Monmouth. And at this point, he's with those men that I'm calling the Veteran Company. That's what they've been called by other historians. And they're the men that were that remained in the 1st and 2nd regiments, and then eventually, as we're about to see, were merged with the new recruits back here in Rhode Island. So here he is, July 10th in Paramus, and 43 days later and a 200-mile walk to Rhode Island. Here is Windsor and the Veteran Company on Aquidneck Island, August 22nd, 1778. This is 1 week before the Battle of Rhode Island. So Windsor saw a lot of action early on. He'd seen plenty more before that, but with the Black Regiment, he was getting his share of action. Now, Windsor was not without some controversy. And here are 2 letters from Christopher Green to George Washington. Basically, what was going on is these men were either not paid, receiving half pay, money that was owed to them. They were on half rations. Sometimes they had no food. So they were leaving the camp. They were breaking into places, stealing food. And it seems Windsor got caught up in that. And Christopher Green wanted to make an example of somebody. And these words are a little harsh if we look at them. Should it be your excellency's opinion to punish capitally for such a crime as his? I think him as proper a subject as can be. Sounds to me like Christopher Green is asking George Washington to go along with a death sentence that was passed down at court-martial of Windsor. And Windsor's having nothing to do with it. He takes off from camp. He's later recaptured and sometime in early October, I believe. And October 14th, it appears Christopher Green is doing a 180. He's basically asking George Washington to now pardon Windsor Green. I believe there was never any intention to execute a man for stealing food. I think he was trying to throw the fear of God into these men and get them back in line. And the reason I believe that, I could find only one situation where a man under the command of Christopher Green was ever executed, and he was shot for desertion. And from the records I read them, it looks like he was trying to escape to the British lines and was probably shot in that process. Much more serious crime to desert to the British side and give them information than to steal food. And there was another situation in the Black Regiment where a man was sentenced to be executed and was led up to the gallows and then told that he'd been pardoned. So I don't believe Christopher Green was ever going to do that. I believe Windsor Fry was a man that was respected by Christopher Green and the other soldiers, and he was just going to try and make an example out of him by scaring him and the other soldiers. So here, 1 week later, George Washington basically says that you have my consent to pardon him. This, like I said, a lot of times they threatened execution for men, but never followed through with it. Found a lot of letters back and forth over whether they're really going to execute someone, and I'm pretty sure that was just what we had in the case of Windsor Fry. So next man from East Greenwich that we're going to talk about, he was originally from North Kingstown. He was an enslaved man that enlisted thanks to that act in 1778. He eventually got an honorable discharge and a pension, Ichabod Northup, and I'm guessing that more than a few of you are familiar with his name in town. He was owned by Emmanuel Northup of North Kingstown. And we know that because Emmanuel was compensated for 2 men, one of them being Ichabod. Okay, and here's the story behind Ichabod, Battle of Pines Bridge. Now this is after the reorganization and the Black unit was basically disbanded, but I followed all 189 of these men all the way through to see what their status was. And here at the Battle of Pines Bridge up in Hudson Valley in New York, May 14th, 1781, Christopher Green is now captain of, or colonel of the Rhode Island Regiment, the combined into one regiment group now. And I believe that was just over 100 men at this time. And they were attacked by a band of loyalists, 200 men on horseback, who outnumbered them and caught the Rhode Island Regiment by surprise. Unfortunately, Christopher Green and 9 other men were killed, and I believe over 24 were taken captive. One of the 24 was our man Ichabod. Ichabod's lucky he wasn't killed that day, and also very lucky that he survived captivity till the end of the war. And he did, and came back to Rhode Island, settled in East Greenwich. Here we find him in the 1790 and the 1800 federal census. And he's the head of household of a family of 7 people of color, all free, and a family of 9 in 1800. No record of Ichabod during 1810, but 1820, he's in the census again. And living just a few doors down from him is Windsor Fry. Now, I would say these 2 men were probably doing better than most of the men of color that came back after the war. They had a roof over their head that they could call their own, and they had a family support system with them, it appears. And you'll hear more about the other men in a minute that were not as lucky. This next document was the foundation for a lot of my research, especially identifying the enslaved men. It's an amazing document, and it's a somewhat troubling document at the same time. It's really a record kept by the General Treasurer of Rhode Island, and it's nothing more than an accounting list, no particular order. You'll see some of the dates when I zoom in. Some of the dates are jumbled around. And what it shows on the left side is the name of the enslaved man, his owner in the middle there, residence just to the right of that, and then to the far right is the value placed on the enslaved man. And that's kind of troubling to look at it and realize that that's the way it was viewed at that time. Here we zoom in on that exact document, and the very first man that appears is Titus Pierce of East Greenwich. And it's important to note on the left-hand side there, he was valued at 120 pounds. Again, the owners were compensated, but they were not happy with the amount they were compensated for, and eventually forced the General Assembly to repeal the act. That high number of 120 would be an indication that Titus was young and in good shape, in the prime of his life, probably. And that's important to remember because we're going to talk about that in just a second. So he was an enslaved man that enlisted thanks to the act. Probably one of the earliest men that enlisted right away in February. And you see there it says Corps of Invalids, and then he disappears. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Here he is in his first muster, and it shows his enlistment date, February 26th. Here he is, another muster from that 22nd of August, just a week before the Battle of Rhode Island. And then we kind of jump ahead to 1781. Not much transpired with Titus in the records between the Battle of Rhode Island and this point in time here in 1781, but he's transferred to the Corps of Invalids with several other men. Corps of Invalids were men that couldn't perform full duty, so they were often, they were given reduced positions, some light guard duty, some did service-related jobs, but how Titus went from being a healthy young man to ending up in the Corps of Invalids is somewhat of a mystery, whether he contracted a disease that he never recovered from, whether he was wounded and it was never recorded in the records, hard to say, but he disappears from the records right after this. Next man we'll talk about is Cyrus Mauney, and he was a resident of East Greenwich, and he was enslaved and enlisted March 9th. He died in 1781, and that's documented, as we'll see. Over 40% of these men in the Black Regiment died of disease, which overall in the American Revolution, probably 2.5 to 3 times the number of men died of disease than those killed on the battlefield. So disease was a very serious problem in these camps that were filled with squalor and various diseases. So here we see Pardon Mauney, different spelling, but we know it's the same man. He didn't have any people of color with him in 1774, but yet in the 1777 military census, he does have one black man living with him. More than likely that's Cyrus, but we can't say that for certain. But this confirms that Cyrus was enslaved by Pardon Mauney, and there we find him on the records of the General Treasurer. Next man we'll talk about is Cato Vernon. That was his real name. It became, it evolved into Cato Varnum relatively early in the musters, and I can't help but wonder that if a man claimed he was from East Greenwich and his name sounded like Varnum, that they thought there was a connection there, and that kind of sped along the process of his name morphing into Varnum. But he became known as Cato Varnum after that. He was originally from Newport, enlisted as an enslaved man. He was a replacement recruit, which means basically he got sent to Valley Forge right after enlisting. They were trying to replace the men that died in Valley Forge that winter in the Rhode Island ranks. And Cato and I think about 7 other men got sent over to join the veteran company to fill in for some of the men that they lost. Excuse me. So Cato ended up with an honorable discharge, as it says right there. That June date was actually a furlough that turned into a honorable discharge. And we'll see a little more of that shortly also. He got a badge of distinction, which meant he served for at least 3 years with honor. And extra duty, what was the extra duty that Cato performed? We're going to hear about that. Just to clarify, James Mitchell Varnum, I found no evidence that he ever had any enslaved people in his household. But over here, William Vernon, he was not only a slave owner, he was a slave trader and a wealthy merchant in Newport, as was the rest of his family. And again, we rely on the General Treasurer's document to tell us that Cato Vernon was owned by William Vernon of Newport. And again, they record the address at Newport, but William and Cato were not in Newport when this took place. The British were in Newport. And kind of a funny number that he was compensated for, 114 pounds. There were 5 committee members that established the compensation number, and that 114 is a little strange. There's a few different ones like that. So how they arrived at 114, if anything, it shows you that they were quibbling over what a man's life was worth. So Cato, with his extra duty, what was his extra duty? We find him here in some of the early musters listing that he's getting extra duty. And then here it begins to get spelled out as the musters progress. Philadelphia on extra duty, waiter for Major McPherson. Major William McPherson was the aide-de-camp for Marquis de Lafayette. So in all likelihood, Cato was a waiter for the Marquis and his officers. He gets returned to regular duty, and like I said, an honorable discharge. Here's another man that had some special duties. And before I talk about him, I'll speak about that. 98% of these men carried a gun and fought as soldiers. Very few of them were servants or service related or something else. These were fighting men. Some of them had special skills. Occasionally a carpenter was taken away to do something. There was a shoemaker in the Black Regiment that was taken away a couple times to work on shoes. But most of these men carried muskets and fought when the time came. And George Sambo is the next man I'll mention here. And he was a free man in East Greenwich. And he died just a little over 2 years later, and that's somewhat of a mystery, but he's on command, which is similar to extra duty. And we see him here again at a week before the Battle of Rhode Island. And at that point in time, he's on command at General Greene's. This is General Nathaniel Greene, who was a brigade commander at the Battle of Rhode Island. And our man George is performing some sort of duties with General Greene. And he remains with General Greene for over a year. Musters show him with General Greene for over a year. And then he suddenly returned to his unit because he shows up there without any special remarks. And the following month, he's deceased. So whether he got sick and was sent back to regular duty, or got sent back to regular duty and got sick in camp, we'll never know, but that was the unfortunate fate for George Sambo. Cato R. Greene. As you've already seen, a lot of men named Cato. That was a fairly common name for enslaved men in Rhode Island and throughout the 13 states. But middle initial, R. We have a Cato W. Greene, who was owned by William Greene, who became governor of Rhode Island in 1778. And this is Cato R. Greene, owned by Richard Greene of Forge Farm. So he enlisted as an enslaved man in 1778. Down here, you'll see I've got that he was born in Africa, and you're going to see how I know that in just 1 second. And he eventually got a pension. One of the few men you're going to hear about that lived long enough to get a pension. But how do we know he? Some of the best looking pension records that I have ever seen. And here on the left side, this is his discharge certificate, signed right here by George Washington. Surprising that men lived long enough to receive that pension in 1818, almost 4 decades after the war. Even more surprising to have them hang on to this document for that period of time, but very incredible document signed by George Washington. If you didn't have that and you were trying to get a pension nearly 40 years after the war, this was the next best document to have right over here. And this is a statement signed by an officer of your unit. And this is a letter stating that Cato was in that unit, signed by Major John Singer Dexter, who was at one time a resident of East Greenwich. And he lived to be 90 some years old. And I'm guessing, I've seen a lot of his letters. He did a lot of signing of these letters from looking at the regimental book and confirming that these men were indeed served in the Continental line. So 2 amazing documents. This next one is also somewhat amazing, but troubling at the same time. These men had to claim that they were under reduced circumstances, meaning they were not financially able to take care of themselves, and they were hoping the federal government would give them a pension. And this is a statement of property and income. And in this record, you can see in the middle, Cato places an X next to his name. You can also see in this letter that he claims he lives in a very old house, and his possessions are 1 table, 4 chairs, and some knives and forks. So Unfortunately, Cato lived like a lot of these men of color did when they came back from the American Revolution. Next two documents in his file, these men had to be declared invalids. There's a certificate stating that Cato was an invalid. And then to the right, this is the statement for Cato's pension and telling when it started and how much he would receive. These men received $8 a month. And those of you that are wondering, $8 a month is equal to about $170 a month today. I'm pretty sure none of us could live on $170 a month today. The $8 might have helped, but it was kind of a sad answer to the problem then. Thomas Spencer, for the most part, his records are unremarkable, except he enlisted as a free man in 1777. And he'd been in the year before in 1776, but when he enlisted in 1777, I believe he thought he enlisted for 3 years. But here on one of his early musters, they've got him marked as DW, during war, or duration of the war. The free men had an option. They could enlist for 3 years, or they could enlist till the end of the war. I'm sure some of them didn't know how long that end of the war was going to be. But that's what it says there. And I've found other records that are a little conflicting under those same issues. So bureaucracy was certainly in place during that time period. But here we see that Thomas did get a discharge after 3 years. I found another record, and it was hard to read, so I didn't copy it, but it shows where it says that he deserted, and then that's crossed out, and it says discharged next to it. Found the exact opposite situation for another man in the Black Regiment. All of his records clearly show that he enlisted as a free man in 1777, enlisted for 3 years. I found that in a couple records. He left when his 3 years was up, was declared a deserter, and was brought back and made to stick around till the end of the war. So I think Thomas was very lucky that he managed to get away with 3 years there. This last man was not a resident before the war of East Greenwich, but he died in East Greenwich, and it's a unique story. One of the stories that I will have written about and will continue to write about till the book is done, but it was kind of a mystery. As you can see there, less than 2 months after enlisting, Ebbins, who was also known as Ebenezer, Richmond, also known as Richards, for a very short period of time, his name got very jumbled up. But anyway, as we see, he's deceased by May 1st, and it was a mystery. Some historians have written that he likely died of disease, and I would have gone along with that. As we see right here, shows died May 1st. And when you see that date of the 1st of the month, that very easily could mean that he died sometime during the prior month, but it's recorded the 1st of the following month. Found that in numerous situations. So I thought perhaps Ebbins had died of disease until I was leafing through Jeremiah Greenman's diary one day, and for April 16th, 1778. Now, Jeremiah is involved in the training of these men during that time, and one of our men had his arm blown off firing an alarm gun. This is an alarm gun, probably about a 28, 30-inch barrel, huge bore, no projectile, but a considerable amount of powder would have been packed in there. That would have been a horrendous injury, having your arm blown off from that. If you managed to survive the considerable blood loss, you faced infection from the burnt gunpowder and whatever other residue entered your body. So no other men in any of the musters for the Black Regiment show any being discharged for any injuries. No men are sick in the hospital, so I'm pretty sure that that was the unfortunate fate of poor Ebbins. So what is the legacy of the Black Regiment? First off, I believe they showed they were able to hold their own in battle. Whether it was the men of African descent, the men of indigenous descent, all of these men, well documented that they fought alongside white men and held their own. Commitment to cause is easy to identify. The permanent desertion rate for the men of the Black Regiment is noticeably lower than it was for the average soldier in the American Revolution. And there were a lot of desertions, a lot of temporary ones and a lot of permanent desertions that took place. And like all men of color that have fought in wars for the United States, I believe these men expected things might have been different for them coming home. They were to some extent, but they came back home and their family and friends could still have been enslaved. Slavery was in decline just prior to the American Revolution. It took a big hit during the American Revolution. And I think, if anything, the fact that these men went off to fight and came back, that it changed some ideas in the hearts and minds of people in the North, seeing that these men served honorably as they did. Many of them faced poverty. Many of the soldiers that came back did, but I think for some of the men of color, it was particularly difficult. And only a few lived long enough to get a pension that was finally awarded to them almost 4 decades after the war. So just taking a quick look at the numbers here. 1780, when the Black Regiment was disbanded and the 2 Rhode Island regiments were combined into one, we went down to 106 on that date. Some killed in action, many, as I have already stated, from disease. A few got early discharges, more got discharges right after that date, the 3 men that signed on for 3 years. That wasn't a lot, but it was a few more men, and some permanent desertions. And then by the end of the war, only 43 of these men remain. You take that 43, and I think when we get down to pensions, we're somewhere in the mid to high teens, if I remember correctly. And here's some officers from East Greenwich. Major John Singer Dexter that I mentioned. He ended up in East Greenwich because his wife was from East Greenwich, and he's listed in the military census of 1777 as being a soldier in the Continental Line and being a resident of East Greenwich. Captain Thomas Arnold, who lost his leg at the Battle of Monmouth. Now, this was before the Black Regiment was officially formed. This happened at the Battle of Monmouth, and he was designated as a captain in the Black Regiment, but he eventually went on to the Corps of Invalids. Then we had 2 lieutenants from East Greenwich, Charles and Daniel Pierce. Here's a picture that I like to point out. This is by famous historical artist Don Troiani. And over in Varnum Armory Museum, they've got a brand new, fairly large copy of this, and it's incredible to see it in person. This shows the Rhode Island Regiment after it was reorganized into one group. There would have been 9 companies. 2 were segregated companies, men of color, and 7 of them were white companies. You can see just the tail end there of a white company. And I'll mention this, some of you might already be familiar with this. These are 2 regimental flags that would have been carried by the Rhode Island Regiment at that time period for that painting we just saw. And they're owned by the state of Rhode Island. And Patrick Donovan and the people over at Varnum Armory are trying to get permission from the state of Rhode Island to restore and conserve these 2 flags. There's only 25 of these flags that remain from the American Revolution. So keep your eyes out if you're not already familiar with that story. That would be incredible to see those 2 flags conserved. I'll mention this also. This is down at Smith's Castle where I volunteer and do a lot of work. And in the foreground here is a Rhode Island slave history medallion. And I know there was a conversation, I believe, has taken place at East Greenwich about placing one of these. And I know of no place in the state of Rhode Island that is more deserving of having one of these monuments that honors the legacy of these men from the Black Regiment that served in the Continental Line. And to the right here, we have a picture of a group, a reenactment group that is dressed as the 1st Rhode Island, also known as the Black Regiment, would have dressed in 1778. And I thank everybody for listening, and I would be happy to take any questions if anyone has any. I hope everybody enjoyed that.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, you had listed Musty. What race was that?
Musty was a mixed race of African descent and indigenous descent,
Okay.
and relatively common during that period of time.
Uh-huh. And I wondered if you had any information about after the groups were integrated in 1781, was there, how did that work out? I mean, did they get along?
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting topic, and no one's asked me about it. Certainly there was a degree of racism that took place. There were periods of time where men of color, particularly men of African descent, were not allowed to enlist. That's why you see when the Rhode Island Regiment was reorganized into just one unit, and we saw in that Don Troiani picture, that was pretty accurate. There were 9 companies, and although they were calling it an integrated company, 2 of the companies were segregated. That happened on and off at various times, and it's tough to pinpoint it because, as I said, there was certainly a degree of racism that took place, undoubtedly, but it wasn't well documented.
Sure.
I find a few letters that I'll refer to in my book where officers occasionally mention the fact that that sometimes the races on both sides didn't want to mix, and at other times they talk about how well they got along with each other. So it's a little confusing, but there certainly was racism, and probably something caused them to separate the men into segregated companies in what they were describing as an integrated unit regiment.
Hi, John. My name is Nora Tony, and I'm the 5th great granddaughter of Windsor Fry. And my mom, hi.
Welcome. I'm glad to meet you.
Thank you. And my mom is under Reverend Betty Tony. She's his 4th great granddaughter. I think she's on mute because I saw her lips moving, but we didn't hear her.
Well,
but
it's an honor to speak to you because you have something to be very proud of. Boy, if I could go back in time, he's a person I would love to have met and talked to because he saw an awful lot.
Yeah, as well as us. And I want to thank you for this presentation, number one. I think you did a fantastic job, and I really appreciate it. I appreciate your passion and your interest in even taking up this subject. One point, at least one point I wanted to point out about my grandfather was that when he went AWOL, if you will, that whole story with Christopher
Green,
Daniel and all, we believe that his wife was pregnant, and they, like you said, they didn't get paid, or they got very little pay, and so he had a wife that was pregnant and needed food, and he was off in the war, and so he went back and dealt with that situation. And we believe there was a real close relationship between, what was he, captain or Lieutenant
Colonel
Dan?
Green?
Colonel Green, yeah.
I would agree 100% with you. I don't believe there was ever any chance that he was going to receive that punishment that they were talking about. I think it was just a scare tactic. Yep.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because these men were so close to home for the first few years that they often wandered away. And that was true of all races.
Mhm.
I've got ancestors that fought in the American Revolution, and I was flabbergasted when I first saw that one of them had deserted for a period of time. I said, oh my God. And then the more I read about it over the years, I saw how common it was. And it was kind of a double-edged sword for them. They lived this close to their families, but it made them a little bit easier to slip out of camp and go visit the family for a couple of days too.
Right.
Yep.
And one other point,
Sure.
in terms of his race, we've done a lot of research as well, especially my mom and her younger sister, a lot of research on it. And we saw the term musty a number of times. And we're of the contention that Windsor Fry was of African descent as well as European descent. And his wife, Lucy, was a Pequot Indian. So that their children, they had that lineage came together. Yep. But because Windsor Fry was freed before the Black Regiment, he was a part of the 1st Regiment, the Rhode Island Regiment. And when he joined, he was a free man. And the research that we have attests to that. So there was a real closeness there.
Yep.
And
That's pretty good.
A fantastic story. No doubt. Fantastic story.
And I know my mom is, I don't know, mommy, I know you must be on mute. She's on
mute. She's on mute. Yeah.
She's been trying to talk, and I don't know where Betty is, if she can take you off of mute or if you want me to come upstairs. But I know she wants to say something too. So I'm going to thank you for listening to me, and thank you for this presentation. It's wonderful.
Thank you for joining us.
Yes, I'm going to go upstairs and see if I can.
Before you leave, I'm going to mention one thing. You talk about my passion in talking about this story, and I don't tell a lot of people, but there's a small group here. And I usually discuss this carefully, but we're talking about mixed race. My 5th great-grandmother was of African descent and was a slave in Virginia, and I grew up and still identify as white, but we all have a lot of surprises in our history, I believe. But that is certainly, knowing that is certainly spurred on my interest in this topic, no doubt.
Wow.
Yep.
So
I had one more. Do you know specifically where that smallpox hospital was in East Greenwich? I mean,
yes, it's the property. The last map I saw, and I see Matt's on here. Matt might remember. It was Fry Farm, I believe, was one of the maps I saw.
That's right. I think that's right, John.
And it's an intersection, and I'm trying to remember.
oh, I know where Fry Farm is.
Yep.
So there must have been a building and.
Yep. It was owned at that period of time by a doctor, and in some of the various historical books written about East Greenwich, it refers to this doctor that owned the property and ran the hospital there. And that's worth mentioning. Although it's called a hospital, it was more to separate people that were inoculated from going back out into the public than it was for people that got sick. Certainly if people got sick, they would have been brought to the hospital, but its first purpose there was to separate the men that were inoculated, because they were contagious for a period of time after being inoculated.
John, I didn't realize there was an inoculation available in those times for smallpox. Was that something relatively new at the time?
No, because what had happened, George Washington and his brother, both in the 1750s, I forget where they traveled to, whether it was Bermuda, somewhere, and they both contracted smallpox. And I believe Washington's brother eventually died. So he was a firm believer when someone finally came out with a smallpox, and the way they did it was a little bit scary back then. It was they created a sizable wound and scraped pus off from someone that had it and put it into the wound. So, but Washington was convinced that it would work, and it seems from everything I've read about smallpox, that was not the disease you had to worry about. It was typhus and diphtheria and a couple other diseases that were worse.
Interesting.
Anyone else?
No?
I could sit here all night, so don't.
Charles, you have a question?
Well, no, I had a question. Are you familiar with the story of Prince Green?
Yes. Yep.
He was a guard in the Black Regiment that was protecting the musicians, I think, in Providence, and was attacked by some white residents and shot one of them, and they brought him to trial, and he proved that he was protecting the regiment and protecting our munitions, and so they charged him with manslaughter and branded him with an M, but he was honorably discharged.
Yep.
Oh.
Yep. And that will be in my book. That's one of, there's a lot of very unique stories. There's historians that have looked at the Black Regiment and identified a lot of these stories. What I tried to do is go a little bit deeper and find the things that other historians had not identified yet. And that's really what history is about, is not being stagnant and continuing to look for things. And I gave you a little tidbit tonight with Ebenezer Richmond in that story, because historically people would never have known. And it just went on, the light bulb went on when I saw Jeremiah Greenman's diary, and I said, wait a minute, that has to be what happened to this man. And there's a lot of other stories in there too.
Well,
where did you get
Go
the
ahead,
documents?
I portray Prince Green because I'm a member of the Black Regiment. In fact, I'm one of the few, in fact, the only Black person that is a member of the Black Regiment. And I appreciate that. It's a part of a legacy I took from my Uncle Paul Gaines. But what is astounding about it is when people come to reenactments like in Lincoln and other locations, and they see a Black person dressed in a costume and carrying a musket that knows how to use it, and they always go up to me and ask me questions, because one of the things that they're excited about is the fact that a person of today would choose to be a reenactor in the Black Regiment, because it's not easy and it's not all that exciting and comfortable, but it's so rewarding, because to go back in time and be absolutely to walk in the footsteps of your ancestors and live and place in a living history is just unbelievable. And it's so great when people of color come up to me and ask me, why am I doing that? And who am I? And I tell them the story of Prince Green and how, and basically he was a hero, because he stood up against white people of the time and killed one of them to protect the munitions of our military, and then we stood trial and went through all of that and was almost executed
Yeah,
for being a real soldier and a real patriot.
a real patriot. Yeah.
Well, you're educating a lot of people, Charles. Keep doing it.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the work that you've done at Smith Castle. We had a good time.
Yes, we did.
And it's very important because there's young people coming behind us that need to hear these stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
We're working on it every day.
Yeah.
And I-
All right. Well, go ahead, Ken. Go
Yeah,
ahead. Ken.
John,
Yes.
where did you get all the documents that you were showing us?
The vast majority of military records are available online now. That's only happened in the past few years. Prior to this, you'd have to usually travel to Washington to get a look at any of these, but almost all of these military records, including the pension files and everything, are available online. The records of the General Assembly are now available online. Just in the past 2 or 3 years, and I think the pandemic kind of spurred that on, because I initially, when I started this project, it was difficult to get into places when the pandemic first started, and that's when I really got spurred on to take a closer look at this topic. So if you look online, you can find them. One of the websites, Ancestry.com, has a sister company called Fold3, and there's a cost associated with it, but they have a tremendous number of records.
Tom, I think you were trying to wrap up, but I just want to jump in real quick to
Sure.
a real thanks to John, because I think we all at the Preservation Society have to thank John, because I think as we were developing our signs program, Patrick Donovan tipped us off that you really need to kind of get into the Black Regiment and the First Rhode Island Regiment and understand the connection. I think it was John who really helped us understand that really the connection is profound, as he shared today. And for the reason we're going to have a sign, as part of our 12 signs that we're going to be installing around town next year. One of them will be all about this subject. John has helped us author it. Charles, thank you for your feedback on it as well. And that'll be going across, right across the main street, across from the current Greenwich Hotel, because that's where William Arnold's Tavern was, where they first gathered. So that's where we're going to put that sign. But I just want to acknowledge both Charles and John very much. John, thank you much for pointing us to this piece of interesting history.
Yes.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you. All right. Well, we'll wrap up. Thank you very much, John.